So I was out running errands today, and I'm lucky. I still, from the last time the state was on fire and the air was all made of smoke. That last time they were handing out the N95s at the fire station, so I went and picked up a few, and then found a couple like in an old jacket earlier when like COVID first happened. So I was like sort of prepared. So I'm like driving around. The other fun part about me running errands right now is that the AC's out in my car, so I have to drive around with my windows down, which is great when the air is all smoky, right? So I'm like coming down J Street wearing like an N95 in my car, like a fucking maniac, and I'm rolling past the fucking spaghetti factory on like 18th or 19th or whatever.
I know where this is.
And there are like 15 people at like 4 p.m. sitting in the parking lot eating fucking old spaghetti factory. Like, this is a bummer for like a multitude of reasons, right? Yeah. For one, it's like 95 fucking degrees out, which is nice for like the way that it's been here for the last few days, right?
Like 112, yeah.
For two, the smoke is so thick you're fucking choking on the air. For three, COVID-19 is still a fucking problem.
Still here.
Or the
spaghetti factory
sucks.
So
that's the most egregious of them all.
I think it might be.
Any risk.
I was like, it blew my fucking mind. I'm driving around like trying to get into the mindset of somebody who's like, you know what sounds hella good right now? You know what is a culinary experience worth sitting on asphalt in 95-degree weather with smoke for air?
Yeah, that's like
fucking old spaghetti factory.
That's like trying to convince a Biden supporter that Biden is just a losing game. Like, you cannot convince people that
I guess
this is a bad idea. I have a running Marco Polo is like an app where you talk video chat with friends. I don't know. I'm an old, so I only recently learned about this.
Okay.
But every day
Flo was doing that with Tareen when he was king of Illinois for a while.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, it's new to me.
King of
very
Illinois.
new to me. But so every day on my drive home from work, I give a report to the people in my Marco Polo thread as to how many folks are eating at the spaghetti factory parking lot. It's an everyday report to them. And what I want to know, like, it's like you're eating your butter noodles and Mazithra shit with just like a dash of finishing ash.
Right.
On top.
It's literally raining ash.
No, yeah. It looks like it's snowing because ash is falling from the sky. But you're like, you know what? I really
need to dine al fresco.
I want some butter noodles.
Yeah. Al fresco is definitely the best way to describe what it's like outdoors in Sacramento right now.
It's very upsetting to me. Why are people the way they are? Who hurt you, Spaghetti Factory patrons?
Well,
no clue.
It's 2020, you know. Shit's wild.
I will say, I saw a photo earlier that I think perfectly encapsulates 2020. And when I saw it, like, it just took my breath away. Okay, I'm gonna put it up.
So if you're listening right now, pause and go to YouTube.
So I see this as I'm scrolling through my social media feed, and for those of you who are listening, it is a picture of the wildfire in Northern California that is in Vallejo and moving its way sort of eastward. And there is this like sign that says Senior Center, come join us. But in between that is another sign that says, wear a mask, wash your hands, social distance, stay safe. And that is the only thing in this image. Everything else is just fire and smoke.
Horror.
I'm not a person, like, I appreciate photography. I love the arts. I don't want the artist community to come for my mentions. But I'm not usually a person who like sees a photo of something that's happening in real life and says, gosh, who was that photographer? Like, I'm always surprised when somebody comes back and like, yes, and he shot the photos of the famine in this place and this way, because I never think about the photographer, right? I just don't. But when I saw this image, I'm living this moment, right? I mean, it's black outside. And I saw this image and I was like, this is the combination of, like, this is the perfect picture for this year. It's like the impact that this is having on older people as a pandemic, the pandemic happening, people, you know, and then these fires coming along. I was like, you captured all of that in one photo. Yeah. Right. And I was just like, who took this photo? And like, go ahead and just print the award with their name on it, because you don't get any better than this. Like,
yeah,
I'm speechless.
It is a classic.
Sums up our time in Northern California in 2020.
This is my favorite piece of art ever.
I know what you're getting for your birthday.
Christmas, yeah.
This is my favorite.
And
the photographer's name is apparently Noah Berger, because again, that's a thing I now know that I would have never known about any other photo. Like Noah, you win.
Like, who took this?
Who took this?
Yeah, we're gonna have to send Noah some money now, because
I'm serious.
Published it, so yeah, let's do it.
All right, Noah, get in touch with us. All right, you guys want to get started?
Sure.
Oh yeah, that'd be nice.
Voices, the things they said. Voices, some from those dead. All the voices heard. Voices, things we say. Voices, they're in your head. All the voices heard.
Hello, everyone. You have Kempa.
And Skylar.
And Shannon.
And Flo.
And we have a special guest today in a writer from the Bay Area on housing justice, Sasha Perigo. How you doing, Sasha?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, super excited to have you. I've been following your work for a while. I've been following your work in The Examiner, but you've also written in Curbed and Hoodline, correct?
Yeah. So I'm a columnist at The Examiner, and then I've just like freelanced with more straight reporting elsewhere.
Very cool. So having you on, an expert on probably the in as much as anyone can be an expert, because it's such a heavy topic.
Fair.
I think that's why you're laughing. Okay. So that's really exciting. I think like the four of us we all kind of fall into different places in expertise, and whereas we can speak on like homelessness very well, I think housing, we're always a little trepidatious about, hopping into it. So super pumped to have you today. So you write about housing and you live in San Francisco.
Yeah.
Tell us what the hell that's like.
Yeah. So, I mean, I got started, my academic background is actually in computer science, but I grew up in the Bay Area. And so I was like a software engineer for like a year. And then I was like, wait a second, I don't really care about this. Like, I've been doing all this like housing organizing on the side because, so many people I know who grew up here placed out. Like, that's true of everyone anywhere in California these days. And like my rent is exorbitant. And so we're like, I did organizing with DSA in San Francisco with the homelessness justice committee, actually. So a lot of the people in the group are like currently and formerly homeless. So I'm like, I really care about this. Let me start trying to cover it. Because I was super nerdy about it. And like, I think the reason I'm laughing when you're like, oh, you're an expert, I swear to God, there's like 10 different parts of housing. Like there's tenants' rights, there's homelessness, there's land use, there's like planning, like, and they're all so technical and crazy. Like that's one of the things that is, I think, the worst about housing, because like it's all like a basic human right that we all need and we all pay way too much for it, and is yet somehow like so complicated, like people don't understand what's going on or like can't be part of the conversation. So it's been interesting. I've learned a lot of technical ins and outs of laws.
So because there's all of these, like, first of all, different subsets of the discussion and also all of these intricacies, am I correct in thinking, I think I saw like a graphic on this recently created by somebody in the Bay Area, that there are like 8 different like sides in the like arguments on this?
Yeah. Yes. And I think it's also like the discourse is really different from like one city to the next. And I grew up in Marin County. I don't know if people in Sacramento are like as familiar with that, but it's basically like one of the very exclusionary white parts of the Bay, even though I'm like was only 10 miles from the Golden Gate Bridge. And so like the tenants' rights conversations in Marin County, where like in my hometown of 10,000 people, we don't have a single apartment building, look very different than like a gentrifying community. And so like, I think that contributes to like the like 10 different sides too, because even people who would be like on the same side are advocating for different things and there's like no cooperation.
Yeah. Well, why don't we just hop right into it? The first thing we wanted to talk to you about today was AB 1436. Would you like to first just tell us what that is?
Yeah, totally. So I'll give a brief summary. So basically, this is like the attempt at doing eviction protection with the pandemic. So right now, most people don't know this. And so people have definitely already been leaving because they can't pay rent. But there was like the judicial court in California basically said we won't be moving forward with eviction cases through September 1st. And so like the landlord can still get ready to file them, but they're just not being processed. And this is actually, it's really notable. It's different than other states. Basically, Gavin Newsom declined to do anything. Like he could have been like, you can't evict anyone because of COVID, and he didn't. And so it's then up to the individual city. And it depends on like whether your city wanted to put like an eviction stay beyond the judicial court. But now what the issue is this expires on September 1st. And they've already said they're not going to extend it. And so the legislature needs to do something, or suddenly we're going to literally see maybe like millions of renter households in California evicted. Like we're talking like 23 million households across the United States. Like this is unprecedented. Like I cannot describe like what a crisis this is. And so what AB 1436 is it's like literally our last chance. So the legislature ends at the end of August, and if this does not pass, like, I don't know what's going to happen. And so we have 10 days to pass it. We've got a week and a half. Sorry?
We've got a week and a half.
Week and a half, yeah. Ourselves.
Okay.
Yeah, and we need a 2/3 majority in the Assembly and the Senate, and the reason that's true is because if you want a bill to take place like immediately instead of the next year, you need 2/3. So it's actually like, it's half for tenants, but it's actually half for like homeowners and small landlords.
Right.
So the half for tenants means that like you can't evict someone because they couldn't pay rent during the pandemic. And tenants would get basically, it's been like going back and forth in like debates and they're trying to amend it, but like 12 to 15 months until the state of emergency ends, like after the state of emergency ends, to pay your rent back. So you don't suddenly have to come up with all your rent tomorrow. And then for landlords and small property owners, their extended mortgage forbearance, which is basically like, in San Francisco, like no one in my age group and like class of income is owning a home, but obviously there are some like low income homeowners elsewhere in California. And so basically it means my understanding is you can't be foreclosed upon for not paying your mortgage. So this would be huge because it right now, like not only like even if tenants could start paying back on September 1st, all of their rent, they still could be evicted for having not paid it for the last few months. And that is what will happen if this bill doesn't pass. So yeah, that's what's going on.
Okay.
I wanted to just jump in here and say, you said something really like profound to me about how there are 8 different sides of this. And then even in your construction of this, you're like, I can't imagine somebody low income owning a house, but apparently those people exist somewhere, because like renting even versus owning has turned into a class issue. And yet there are still these pockets 100%. Of places where you can be also in the low income space and also own a home, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a really interesting dynamic, and it was one that like I don't think I was even aware of just how difficult a position that can put you in when you are still really in poverty, but you also happen to be a homeowner, because at this point I transitioned over to, you know, your perspective, which is like, this is one of the fundamental like dividers in terms of whether or not, like what class you're in, how much money you have, is whether or not you even have the ability to own a home.
Well, home ownership is really like, is traditionally, that is the first step in working class people entering the capitalist class, right? Like that is the biggest way in which working class people are able to begin actually building wealth, instead of just working
passively,
paycheck to paycheck.
Yeah.
Right,
yes,
exactly.
But it's also something that had such a lower bar to entry in terms of finances not that long ago.
Right.
Is what I'm saying. Like it was very reasonable for you to still be a person who would be considered to be poor and also to own your home a generation ago.
Right.
Yeah.
Like that was not like the Connors owned their home on Roseanne, you know what I mean? Like, and that was not an unusual thing. And now it's becoming a thing where that's like, you don't, right? Like that's not accessible. And I mean, obviously we have to layer racism and all the other things on top of this, but I'm just thinking like of just how quickly the socioeconomics of this have changed. And I hadn't thought about that until you were just describing that at the end. And I was like, that wasn't always true in my lifetime, right? Like,
right.
I mean,
I still can't get over the Roseanne reference here.
I love it.
One of the things that I wanted to jump in and kind of say about this is to like kind of follow it through to its natural conclusion, right? Because this isn't like a new idea. Basically, as soon as COVID happened and the layoffs started in, like people were like, okay, we got to like address the rent situation in one way or another. And it really like even this, which obviously like this, like Sasha said, is a necessity because there's not there like the alternative to this is just like mass homelessness in the middle of a pandemic, right? Which also doesn't help landlords. Like you know, you mentioned like if nobody's paying your rent, then you can't like, dude, a lot of these people who are landlords can't afford to own their properties without somebody else paying their fucking mortgage for them in the form of rent, right? So it's not even like this is like some big boon to renters, and it also just kicks the can down the road because I mean it is cool that like in the language of this bill that there's like 12 to 15 month cushion, you know, to be like, okay, you can pay back all this rent, but still, I mean, like you're going to take a bunch of people who haven't worked in a year or whatever and be like, okay, on top of all your other living expenses for the rest of the year, you also have to come up with like $20,000 to give your landlord. Like that's not, we're like,
when you were barely affording it in the first place.
Exactly. Yeah. And so like what we are doing is, I mean, and this is still necessary. This is not meant as like a criticism to the bill, but like, there's another crisis coming then whenever that bill becomes due, we're looking at another crisis because you're going to have all of these people who did get to stay in their homes and that's great, but all of them are going to get these bills that they can't possibly fucking afford. And it's just going to be another fucking fiasco, right?
It's almost like we govern and legislate reactively as opposed to proactively.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, and it's really interesting to look at. I mean, first of all, our legislature was never going to do something like cancel rent. Like that's just, they're probably honestly, just quick shout out. I talked to my friend who works for Tenants Together, which is like the statewide tenants org before this, because I wanted to make sure like hit the talking points. And this is not a sure thing that this will pass at all. And so like, if you're hearing this right now and you want to do something, definitely call your senator. It's an assembly bill. It's kind of complicated. Basically, it's in the Senate right now. Also call your assembly member. And actually, the Sacramento senator is like not a swing vote, but isn't a sure yes. But a lot of the people south of Sacramento are the swing votes. So if you're listening and you're in like the Northern California region, please call your legislator. But yeah, in terms of like, what if, you know, the legislature was never going to do anything more radical, but they're literally not allowed to cancel rent because of a federal policy that like requires that like you don't break contracts with landlords. The state also has like a clause that says landlords are landlords are basically the only people in the state of California who are like given a guaranteed return on their investment. Like they are required to make money. And like, even if you have rent control or something and your landlord isn't making money, they can actually go to the court and be like, hey, I'm not making money, so I have to increase my tenant's rent. So I not just break even, but turn a profit. And they win that case. So yeah, pretty mind blowing.
I wanted to bring it back to the call your senator piece, and like I think it's really important, but it's also it's a thing we drive home maybe almost every episode. This is a state completely run by Democrats. Every single major office, every statewide office, and at least 2/3 and nearing 75% in both houses of the legislature. And yet, this party that is ostensibly supposed to be working for the working people, it's like pulling teeth with a big portion of them.
Right.
And I always encourage listeners to maybe think beyond that and maybe think further to the left, because there are a lot of business-oriented, capitalist-oriented Democrats out there.
And you should see that, and you should think, your brain should just be like Republican, right? Like that class of Democrat, if you're a fucking like
totally.
capitalist business, quote unquote, business-oriented Democrat, you're a fucking Republican.
Yeah, I say like a not racist Republican, usually.
Yeah.
I mean, I wouldn't even take that for fucking granted.
Well, okay.
Yeah, I mean, I would say
diet
like
Republican.
A diet Republican.
The
I can do
local
that.
kind.
if this doesn't pass, like if it doesn't get 2/3, like you're saying, that means Democrats didn't vote for it. Like there will be Democrats in the like legislature who didn't vote for it, and there will be Democrats who don't vote for it. And I would say if you're voting for mass homelessness in the state, like that is pretty fucking racist. Also like classist, like we see who this disproportionately affects. But honestly, I would say like I don't love the framing like, oh, they're basically Republicans. Because I think that one of the things that I think it's so important to hit home is like, I think this is expected of Democrats, right? Like this is the Democratic, like Gavin Newsom has done so much worse on protecting like us from eviction than some Republican governors, like Kansas, Texas, the Republican governor of New Hampshire, all passed eviction moratoriums. And like, you notice how in California, in New York, in all these like liberal cities, in all these liberal states, like we have some of the worst housing crises in the nation. Like, it's not a coincidence that this like aligns with like really capitalist politics. So, yeah,
and
I think the Democrats are all.
I did want to bring, I did at one point want to bring it back to him because, like you said, he could have acted on this a long time ago, and he didn't. And what immediately came to mind to me was that he's worth multiple millions of dollars, and his friends are also of the capitalist class, and he works kind of alongside them and with their state of mind.
Well, and he also wants to run for president, right? And if he's going to launch a successful presidential campaign, he can't piss off all the capitalists.
Mass homelessness also isn't a good strategy, so I don't know.
He's in it's been a rock in a hard place for that dude right now, I think.
It's really interesting to me that, like, interesting, that's the wrong word, fucking annoying as hell, that this, like, we're in this space where we are fighting for an obvious solution that helps people, right? Like helps keep people housed. And we're doing this in the landscape of various communities across the state who are deciding not to support people experiencing homelessness with a basic right to shelter. And they're experiencing sort of like the fallout to that, right? Like people are pissed, people are dying, all of these different things. And they look at that, our legislators look at that and they're like, you know what? I'm going to take more of that. So I'm not going to pass this shit because that's cool. Like, what is it? Like, you're actually looking at the outcome of not passing an assembly bill that like you're watching what could happen right now, but like times 23 million more households, and still making the decision not to help people. It's
unconscionable.
Yeah, capitalism can really go fuck itself.
Well, it's also really short-sighted, right? Because it doesn't, dude, kicking 23 million Californians out into the street because they can't afford their rent doesn't help anything.
I don't even think that's it, Skylar. I honestly, I'm in the dark place. I'm in the dark and twisty place. I'm not in the sweet summer child place.
Well,
I'm in the capitalism does not give a fuck.
Yeah.
23 million. That's a Thursday.
That's the market being free, guys.
The capitalism gives zero fucks. And I really feel like at this point, it's not even cutting your nose to spite your face. Like, this has no effect. The wealth inequality is so big in this country, it will literally have no effect.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Like, there was a time where you had to feel this, where you had to see it in your faith community, see it in your actual communities, because the wealth gap wasn't this big. It is so big that we are literally living, I mean, not literally, but we're almost literally living in different worlds. We're that far apart on this planet.
Mm-hmm. Can we move it on a little bit? Like, we were talking about Democrats, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking about how, you were kind of saying like, well, Democrats are expected to do this, but there will also be some who, do vote for it, right? And so it's like, we've talked a bit about over the months that like, my personal opinion is that the Democrat tent is so large that it means absolutely nothing anymore.
Right.
So you have different sort of factions of Democrat at this point.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to talk about kind of one microcosm of that phenomenon here in California. Because here in California, we obviously, our electoral system is different than other states. We have the top two primary, a jungle primary, where the top two candidates, no matter their party, can end up running against each other one-on-one in the general. Out there in San Francisco, you have an increasingly interesting race between two people, Scott Wiener and Jackie Fielder. They're both Democrats, but they're both pretty different people. Can you tell us a little about them?
Yeah, totally. And I'm really interested to hear your point of view on this too, because I'm curious how people outside of San Francisco view Scott Wiener. So Scott Weiner is our state senator in San Francisco. He's a super powerful guy. It's worth noting that each state senator in California represents more people than like Nancy Pelosi. They represent more people than your assembly person. So they're really powerful. California has a huge fucking budget, so they have a lot of money at their disposal. And his whole thing is he's like the housing guy in Sacramento. And what I mean by that is like, there really was not a conversation around land use or even tenants. There's still not a conversation around tenants' rights in the legislature in California until Scott Wiener got there. And now people in the legislature kind of look at him and they're like, okay, we're going to defer to you and you're going to introduce these bills and you're going to solve this crisis. But his bills have been very controversial. And like the way he views it has been very controversial. So that's kind of the background on him. In San Francisco, we kind of have, San Francisco is the perfect epitome of like the last Republican that was elected in San Francisco was ousted over a decade ago. We do not have any Republicans elected in San Francisco. And that doesn't mean that people aren't conservative, they kind of
totally.
Yeah. And so we kind of have these two wings that are increasingly becoming less relevant. But there's like the progs and the mods. And so Scott Wiener is definitely seen as a mod. He's seen as very pro-business. And honestly, his record when he was on the Board of Supervisors was much more conservative because he was a supervisor before he was a senator than it is in the legislature. And because of that, kind of universally from the prog side of San Francisco, he is not well liked. And so Jackie Fielder is really young. Which I think is awesome. We actually went to college together. She's still 25, super cool. And she is a socialist, so she's really involved with DSASF here. She's been a long-time organizer. She founded like the SF Public Bank Coalition in San Francisco, and she actually led the No on H campaign, which I have like a poster of behind me, which in San Francisco was the police union was trying to increase the use of force guidelines. Basically, like the ACLU called it like one of the most cynical pro-policing measures they'd seen in decades. And they poured a ton of money into it. And like literally the only campaign that spun up against it was like these haphazard socialists in their 20s and 30s, and they defeated it with like no money. So Jackie ran that. And so Jackie's whole thing is running against Scott Wiener because she criticizes his views on policing a lot, on homelessness, and she criticizes a lot his views to new housing construction. And so that is the race. And she's totally a newcomer.
Can you say more about those views?
Yeah. So, okay, I'll start with homelessness and policing. So a couple of the things. Scott Wiener was the only major politician to endorse Yes on H. So the use of force guidelines. He endorsed Yes on H.
And can you tell our listeners what Yes on H was, just in case they don't remember?
Yeah. So this is like the measure I was talking about that would have increased use of force guidelines for police. So they wrapped it up and they said,
so it makes it easier for them to use force against.
Yeah. So it was called, people kind of in San Francisco knew it as the taser measure, because the way it looked like is it said like, okay, this measure will give police tasers. And they said like, oh, we want tasers because they're less deadly. No, less deadly. They're still deadly. And so wouldn't you rather us have this at our disposal than guns? Personally, no, I don't think they should have more weapons, but also that wasn't the question. There was this whole other part of the bill that changed the use of force guidelines to allow police to attack people with whatever weapon when they're running away with their backs turned.
Nope.
So horrible.
This sounds like some shoot him in the leg shit, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so he has since said that was a mistake.
Yeah.
But this happened. Yeah, and then the other huge thing that people are very mad about in San Francisco, I mean, there's a lot, but this is the other one that comes up a lot during the campaign. There was this measure called Our City, Our Home, Prop C, that taxed big. It was written by a bunch of like homeless service providers and a coalition of folks who are like currently and formerly homeless, with the input of like a lot of like economic experts and stuff as well. It was a really broad coalition, but it included homeless folks, which is cool, and unhoused folks. And so basically it was gonna tax big businesses to like fund homeless services. And it was going to create a lot more affordable housing in the city, a lot more services, a lot more navigation centers, like a huge proportion of money compared to what we'd seen before. Scott Wiener opposed this measure. And what's worse is that he and, interestingly, David Chu, who's seen as one of the most progressive people in the California Assembly, he's also seen as a moderate in San Francisco, and London Breed, our mayor, all opposed this. And it fell just short of reaching the 2/3 percentage. It still passed, so we only needed 50% to pass, but there's this like, the California Supreme Court ruled this thing, or like it was a lower court, that like you're allowed to levy taxes in some circumstances with less than 2/3, and that's new, but people are still mad about it and so they sue. Basically, one could argue that because of Scott Wiener, David Chu, and London Breed, that money is held up in court right now and will be for several years. And had they not, that would be accessible today.
Right.
So I would say those are, there's other ones, but those are kind of the two big things people talk about.
Yeah. So I've read a bit about Scott. Do you all want to weigh in first?
Yeah, I think you're right in the sense that Scott is seen as being pretty progressive in Sacramento. I think in part because you're getting everybody from all over the state, and it's being in the legislature is a reminder that like California gets this super lefty progressive kind of reputation, and it's only by comparison.
Right.
And the same thing is true when you actually really like look at the demographics of California. So yes, he comes across as one of the people who on most of the sort of like your basic Democratic ticket, what are the things we would say we wanted to do things, you don't get any argument from him. You don't spend a whole lot of time lobbying him. But it's those tricky things that are actually going to undermine the system that exists that suddenly become a little tougher of a sell with him. But you don't notice it because you're so busy fighting much harder fights with seemingly harder targets that you don't realize when your friends, essentially, you know, and I'm using that maybe in air quotes, are actually not really that friendly with your cause, right? Because you're having, you know, basic humanity conversations about like, what is a person with other, with other folks. So then by comparison, it seems like, oh, well, he's caught up in the details and he's worried about and then you got to take a step back and be like, wait, what? You know? So I think you're right in the sense of like our perspective on him is going to be very different because you live in a place where the center is even shifted more than the place that we live in. And we're also on a regular basis bombarded with people from all over the state. And so those perspectives kind of converge here. And so we're a little closer to the mean in terms of what we think is normal or with the center, right? Whereas like, you know, in other places, you're going to be, you know, shifted in one direction or the other.
Yeah, I'd also say like, it's not because y'all haven't noticed, it's because he votes differently in the Senate. He really does. Like, and you know, his argument is that he's moved on these issues, or that we're wrong, or that there's technical details of these that we didn't understand. But he does vote for police reform stuff and he votes for the type of homeless services and police reform stuff in the Senate that he opposes in San Francisco, which is a weird dynamic. So it's not just that y'all didn't notice because the legislature is more centrist, which is true, but also his votes are more progressive in the legislature, which is weird.
Okay, that's weird.
Yeah. One thing that I wanted to ask you and get your take on, because there certainly is, obviously there's an angle on this that is reminiscent of AOC and Crowley's race, right? Where like sort of this young upstart socialist came in and unseated somebody who was seen at the beginning of that race to be pretty much unbeatable on a slam dunk. Now, obviously there are like a lot of different circumstances between that race and this race. But I think she's like, as far as I can tell, and this is why I want your take on it, she seems like she's sort of trying to like generate that energy of like, like the odds are against us. This is a David and Goliath thing, but like there's enough people like me who are passionate about like real change and actually progressive issues that I like, maybe I have a shot. I know she's being outspent.
Although in the last quarter, she raised as much money as he did, which was a surprise to a lot of people.
The difference will be the IEs, corporate spending on like the independent expenditures, like kind of like California PACs. But yeah, I mean, yeah, I would completely agree with you, Skylar. I think that is totally her approach. I think in a lot of ways, she's trying to emulate AOC, both in like, you know, young woman of color, upstart socialist, also, you know, Jackie used to live in her van. She was a bartender for a while. Like she's really trying to emphasize those parallels.
Right.
And I think that they're working on that marketing really hard. I do think she's doing surprisingly well. Like, I think that, I don't know how, again, I'm curious how people like view this outside of San Francisco. In San Francisco, it was very clear to a lot of people that this was an incredibly long shot campaign.
Right.
Like usually people who run for the state Senate have a lot of experience in politics. She has no experience in politics. And so because of that, we weren't even sure if she'd get endorsements from the Prague supervisors. She has. And I think a lot of that is because she did really well in the primary. And mind you, the spread between them, I think she got 35%, presumably to his 65%. So that's a 30-point spread. Like, that's not close, but that is so much better than people thought she was going to do. Like, she could have gotten like 20%. And it actually puts her in a good place to be, I don't know, I'm not a campaign strategy person. To me, it feels like maybe it's going to be a little bit closer than people on the campaign strategy side are saying. I think people are saying
it's legitimizing.
Yeah, people are saying it would be good for her if she gets within 10 points. To me, it feels like it might be competitive, but like, what the fuck do I know? But the fact that she raised so much money, and again, it was all from small donors, is encouraging, and she's gotten some
Absolutely.
major endorsements.
Can I ask if the progressive Board of Soups members didn't he run against 2 progressive Board of Soup members, or at least one in his first time around for Senate?
Yeah, so he ran against Jane Kim. Jane Kim is not a socialist, but she was one of the more progressive people, probably the most progressive people on the Board of Supervisors. She ran California's Bernie campaign, is what she went on to do after this. And yeah, it was a really, really, really messy race. Some people will blame this on Scott, some people will blame it on the press, but people leaked something about her, and we don't know if it was the Wiener campaign, but being a homewrecker and like hooking up with like a major person who was married. Came out in the middle of her campaign, like a lot of accusations of racism and sexism there. And it got super, super messy. Like I've heard people in the Scott Wiener camp say stuff as like out there as like Jane Kim should be in jail, you know, like they hate each other. And it became really close. Like it was, I think within less than 1%, maybe. I didn't live in the city at this time. I've lived in the Bay Area my whole life, but I moved to the city in 2017. But I think it might've been within like 0.5%. And that is where a lot of this animosity sprung from. I don't know if Jane has endorsed Jackie.
Okay. But there might be some lingering acrimony between just the progs and him.
Oh yeah. Oh
okay.
yeah.
and that might play an element in Fielder's support, possibly.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Can I ask, like, kind of my read on him was always that he's like a mildly, like he could like, if you didn't know him well, he could fashion himself a progressive. All of these, we have a lot of politicians here in Sacramento who like to say they're a progressive, and they are very far from it.
Yeah, real quick, I would just like to say, like, for anybody listening to this, like, my take on that is like progressive is now where like buying organic was like 15 years ago. Where like when farms first started doing organic, it actually did mean something. And like it was a thing to look for when you were in the grocery store, but then like fucking corporate farms took it over and found all these loopholes to where they could throw fucking organic on any fucking thing they pumped out, and now it doesn't mean fucking shit. The exact same thing is happening with the word progressive, and like Daryl Steinberg fucking promotes his rent control shit as being progressive.
Right.
It means absolutely fucking nothing.
And our opinion editor at the Bee, you know, likes to laud him as progressive. And that's the same opinion editor that was the comms guy for Jerry Brown, who worked together with him to end redevelopment housing dollars, right? So it's all right.
Be skeptical of fucking conservative Democrats using the word progressive, because it is basically meanstless at this point.
Even in cities like San Francisco, where it is like plus 70D or whatever, right? And like, there's still a huge difference between the interests of capital and the people who, I mean, really like socialists, right? Yeah. And I see that. I've always, and like, I don't want to like besmirch the city you live in, but I saw some of the worst anti-homeless rhetoric that I've ever heard in my life in, you know, progressive San Francisco. Yeah. So I feel like it's probably changed a lot over the years.
I would also say that let's not be coy about the fact that, you know, the faux progressivism is often like dripped in white supremacy and racism, right?
Right.
So it's all about like, I'm okay with being around those like, I don't have a problem with your skin being different, but I have a problem with all the ways that oppression has harmed you being different from mine. So I'm fine with, you know, Black people who know how to code switch and who have had all the proper trimmings of colonialism, but I'm not actually interested in experiencing people who also have all of the pains of the trauma, right? Like I want to see the exceptions, not the rule. And that is, that in and of itself is a way to sort of be, you know, what is often seen as progressive, but is actually like, when it comes down to it, you're not actually interested in closing these gaps. You're interested in feeling better than the other people who are also not interested in closing these gaps, right? And that just has to be called out as part of the challenge, right? Of this progressiveness, is that it's not real.
Yeah. Yeah, and you see that with like So yeah, I think Scott Wiener definitely builds himself. So in San Francisco, people will talk about like lowercase p progressive, which is just progressive progressive is not an ideology for
We're
all
all
of the
like
reasons
forming our own
Skylar's
like
saying.
language around this in our own
Yes.
divisions.
Yes.
We're gonna have to be like Italy eventually, where we all like create one language on who's what where. But keep going. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but anyways, lowercase p progressive, ideologically progressive. I put that in air quotes if you're not watching this in video. But then capital P progressive is not more progressive, but like the political party. It's not a party, but like the voting bloc in San Francisco that is progressive. And I would say like this applies to the capital P progressives in San Francisco too, of which Scott Wiener is not one of them. Scott Wiener sometimes criticizes the huge, this is the whole, like literally we could talk about this for the entire hour, so I don't know how deep we want to get into this, but the huge conversation where a lot of other anger is about Scott Wiener is SB 50.
I was wondering if I had time to bring that up. So let's let's take
the first time he came up on this episode was around SB 50.
Yeah,
right? Like a little
I mean,
while
of course, right?
Yeah,
let's do it. Well, we have you. Let's do it. All right.
Oh my gosh. I feel like my take on this just makes everyone mad. And I think that it makes everyone mad because, again, I'm from the suburbs, right? And so, like, is Marin County ever going to choose to build apartment buildings without state intervention? Abso-fucking-lutely not. We need some state intervention. It will never happen. Does that mean that state intervention that broadly takes control away from every single community is the right answer? No. To me, I think it's not about state versus local control. It's about who has control. And like, this is such a pet peeve of mine because I feel like people who don't talk about it this way, it's just like missing the entire class analysis of it and like racial analysis of it and like all of the above. But it's like, if a community of color has control over what is built in their community and they're a low-income community of color, that's great. If a rich white community has influence over like what they're building in their community, that sucks. And you see this in Marin where they have the local control over like, and these rich white people are like, we're never going to build any apartment buildings because poor people will move here. And like, that is literally verbatim what they say sometimes.
Yeah.
But also when you have the business interests of like rich developers who go for like low income communities and try and evict rent controlled tenants, that's still capital having power. And so it's not the issue of just like taking it away at a local level. So basically, SB 50 is a minefield because on the one hand, there's there's a lot of supporters of Scott Wiener who are like from the urbanist side who will look at Jackie Fielder and be like, she is a NIMBY because she is running against Scott. No, she's not a NIMBY. She does support high density housing. She absolutely supports like housing for low income folks, like 100%. But are there people?
Is she a FIMBY?
Yeah, I think she'd probably identify as a FIMBY. So FIMBY is progressive housing, or sorry, public housing in
public
my backyard.
Housing, yeah, in my backyard, yeah.
I've
been learning these. I think I'm a FIMBY.
This is the first I've heard of a FIMBY.
Yeah,
I like this.
It's where you want public housing in your backyard. Yeah,
right.
So what does it stand? Spell it for me?
Huh? Oh, so NIMBY is not in my backyard.
I know NIMBY and I know YIMBY, but I don't know even what you're saying. Are you saying
so the intricacy? Yeah, the intricacy.
PHIMBY. Yeah, public housing in my backyard.
Oh, you are saying FIMBY. Okay.
Yeah.
I really couldn't tell, and I was like,
the intricacy here is when you try and go up against what Jackie's going up against, all of these moneyed interests are like, oh, well, you're a NIMBY, and it's like, no, like I definitely want housing, but we need housing for the right people and for the right reason, and in the and that's kind of where FIMBY comes from, I think. Sasha, let me know if I'm incorrect there.
Yes. So but I would say,
okay,
where this gets tricky is NIMBYs co-opt this language. And so you have all the people in Marin saying like, we care about housing people, but we just want the right housing. And like, is this affordable housing? But they don't want housing at all. And like, I did this like deep dive into like the history of NIMBYism for one piece I wrote for Curbed SF in the Bay Area, and who are these groups and where do they have power? they have way more power in the suburbs than people think they have. NIMBYs are real, and they exist in San Francisco too. And the problem is, often they do vote for the progs, and they do it under this like co-option of like, oh, we want, you know, like community planning, but who is the community that they want planning for?
Right.
And so it gets really tough because this is the whole debacle. So yeah, and people try and make it two sides. They try and make it NIMBY versus YIMBY, and it's just not that simple. Like, this
was my first foray into the California housing debate. And like, I immediately backed away from it. Like, no, I don't know what the fuck's going on.
It's insufferable.
Okay, well, I mean, I think that was enough on SB 50, I guess. We don't have to, yeah. But yeah. I'm really glad we got to touch on that, you know, in regard to Scott. You know, the next reason that I'm so glad, like, I didn't even know that you were a part of this right now. And this is sort of like, this is news that's happening right now. It's not necessarily housing related, but it is workers' rights related. The whole Uber and Lyft kind of, what I guess you would call a capital strike, right? That's where the capitalist interest of a company goes on strike and you know, basically says they're going to take the ball and go home if they don't get their way. Can you tell us a little bit about what Uber and Lyft are trying to do? I guess we probably have to give some background on what was that, AB5, Gonzalez's.
Yeah, sure. So a little background as to how I got into this. I'm related to this for my day job. I'm definitely not speaking for I'm not speaking for the campaign. I don't work for the campaign, not speaking for my employer, speaking for myself. But yeah, so some background. AB5 is this groundbreaking piece of workers' rights legislation, labor rights legislation that passed last year in California. And it's actually not a new law. It's implementing, like, so there was a court decision that was about whether or not someone could be an independent contractor, which means companies get to pay them less, they get to deny them benefits, healthcare, retirement, unemployment insurance, which is huge right now, hazard pay, sick leave, all the above, or that they're a full employee and they get benefits. And companies were kind of just like calling everyone an independent contractors. They didn't have to do anything. And there was a California Supreme Court case that said, like, wait a second, no, like there's actually needs to be rules about who can be an independent contractor and who can't. And they made the rules stricter. Or they didn't make the rules stricter, they interpreted the existing law as stricter than people had previously interpreted it. And so what AB5 was, is it codified that into law. And the reason that that is important is because previously you would have to sue every single individual company and like in order to enforce this. And this gives like the attorney general and cities like more power to enforce it. So they can actually make the companies follow it. And so the big implication, AB5 has been very controversial. I wholeheartely support it, even though I do think we need some cleanup bills, which is typical.
As a freelance writer, fellow freelancer, yeah, no, I agree. There's some confusion.
As someone in public health who's trying not to engage in slavery when we do, you know, public outreach and involvement, there are some cleanup bills that are needed, but I'm in the same boat as you.
But Gonzalez has been totally open and like they encourage people to reach out to them and try and work out those kinks.
Yeah. So I am, now it's not my only job, but for a while it was. I was a freelance writer for a while too. And yeah, for sure, it hurts freelance writers. Like right now, the status quo under AB5 is that you can only contribute a certain amount to a publication before you have to be an employee. No publications have the money to hire you. So it just means basically you can't write and you lose, it's very strict. And so a lot of people are really suffering from that for sure. And it sucks that that was implemented that way. But I think one thing that's worth noting is when you have such a groundbreaking piece of legislation that changes so much at once, it is typical for there to be a period of cleanup bills. And I think what's so important is we should demand that because all workers deserve a living wage, but also we need to be in solidarity with the people who this bill really helped, who are gig workers. Predominantly, you think of Uber and Lyft drivers, Instacart shoppers, DoorDash, DoorDashers. Yeah, so that is AB5. And then I guess where we are today, that passed. Uber and Lyft and all these other companies were just like, who cares? Like, they just didn't follow it. So it went into effect in January. And at this point, the state was like, wait a second, like, this isn't optional. Like, you can't just not follow the law. And so in May, they filed a lawsuit and they said, you have to follow the law. It's just against Uber and Lyft. And that was held off. Like, they didn't prosecute it for a while, or they didn't, I don't know if it's a criminal case. They didn't take it to court for a while because of COVID. The courts were closed. And they just had the injunction, which I guess learned all these legal terms recently, means like it was officially filed. And Uber and Lyft were saying like, they're running this ballot measure now. So they're trying to repeal AB5, but go even farther and basically make it incredibly hard for the legislature to ever pass rights for workers, gig workers, and basically make sure there's never a union, stuff like that. And this is called Prop 22. And so they told the court, they're like, we shouldn't have to follow the law yet because voters are voting on it in November. And the federal judge literally laughed at them. And like, I was listening to the hearing, it was like, so you're telling me you shouldn't have to follow a law because the law might change in the future? Like, no, you know? And so they lost, and they are mad, and they're throwing a tantrum and trying to scare people into voting yes on 22 by cutting off all rideshare in California through November, and claiming that it's because the state forced them to shut down.
Right.
And that starts tonight, that they're shutting off rideshare. So long background, but that's what's going on.
But Lyft isn't.
They just gotta stay. Right? No, they just gotta stay. They just
So today a judge did tell them that they don't have to do this until
it's until October 13th. So that just happened.
So Lyft. This was earlier this afternoon.
Yeah.
So Lyft will not. Uber, I think, still is going to go, but Lyft is not.
This is literally. This is since I was at the rally this afternoon. I am finding this out now. I'm looking at this article.
Breaking right now, listeners.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. The court ruled in their favor, and now they're not shutting down.
They have until mid-October.
And then they'll be shut down for 3 weeks.
Fuck that.
But they'll shut down right then, because that's when the election's going to come.
Right. And people will be all pissed off. Right. And won't like find different businesses to work through.
Right.
I have so many thoughts on this.
Yeah.
It's tricky, you know, like, I mean, like, obviously I'm always going to come out in favor of like workers' rights, and fucking like my philosophy is, if you run a business that can't operate by paying your employees a fair wage and like a fair quality of life, then you run a better fucking business, right? Like, I'm like, that's always going to be where I'm going to come from on stuff like this. The other side of it is that I know a lot of people, like a lot of people who supplement their income using these services. And like, I know that if these companies do shut down, it will affect people who like need that income. And so it's not like an easy, it's not easy for me. And I'm always going to come down where my principles are, but I know people who are going to, who this is going to really hurt, you know, if they do end up shutting these things down.
Yeah. Well, just to address that, and then I'll let other people jump in, because I know I'm on a little bit of a tangent here, but 100%.
Why we have you on. So yeah.
I think that is why we are so like, this is going to hurt people. There's a lot of, it was really hard for people to access unemployment who are drivers because their companies don't play into unemployment insurance. The only reason they're allowed to access it is because of the federal expansion for COVID. But there's still a lot of people who can't access it. Like, I'm sure y'all know, I know people who are still waiting on their unemployment payments, but also people whose unemployment isn't enough. That's a lot of these people. Unemployment is not enough if you like drive for these services and you don't make a ton of money. People who are undocumented, there's a lot of people who can't access it. And it is so fucked up that these companies would pull out in the middle of when people need income the most. But I think the reason I wanted to address this is because And again, I can't say for sure, but I think that this is a very typical tactic of bosses. They threaten to pull out, they threaten to shut down when workers get their rights. I think that after November, I think it is very unlikely that we would actually see these companies like threaten to pull out permanently if they lose, because this is the biggest market in the United States for them. They pulled out of Austin for a while to protest a law there, and actually another company swooped in and took a tremendous amount of their market share before they came back. That really hurt them. And also, after November, it wouldn't make sense to me for Uber and Lyft to remain allied on this issue, because even though like they would have to have more expenses by following this law, if Uber pulls out, Lyft can gain more market share in the biggest market in the United States. That might be revenue positive for them in terms of like the outcome of this. So I don't think we're going to see them allied for long. And does that mean that like people should have to suffer through a few months of like no income? Abso-fucking-lutely not. But I think it's important that we talk about the fact that this is an expected and manipulative tactic from bosses, and it's not because they can't afford it.
Yeah.
Right. And we were talking about this earlier today, Flo. Lyft, Uber, and DoorDash, I believe all three of them pledged to put $30 million into Yes on Prop 22. And that's $30 million that could go to taking care of their workers.
Yeah.
So they're
collectively, they've collectively spent $112 million.
So
it was 30 million each.
22 more than that. Yeah. So like this is obviously okay. Well, I'm gonna go on my own little rant. If you'll
rant away, rant on, young Padawan.
Situation is the perfect Padawan example of the smoke and mirrors bullshit of venture capital and the tech world. Like, what they did is they like made an app, like, ooh, it's like taxis, but an app. And then they threw all of these millions and millions of dollars into it. They weren't even in the black in their first few years doing this kind of thing.
Yeah, they're still not. I was going to say, both of these companies are hemorrhaging money.
So they've never made a profit, even more to my point. And basically they go in and disrupt by having a cheaper service than a taxi. But they're like, well, our innovation is it's an app. But really what their innovation is they're fucking not like not
they have employees they don't
their
have
workers. Yeah. And so this is what they do. They basically bleed all of the taxi companies that, you know, if you're working there, you actually have, you know, benefits and rights. And then suddenly it's this whole new surf system that they have in place. And then when something like this rolls around, you know, when workers stand up and actually try and fight for themselves, and which, by the way, that happens a lot, and people have tried to organize, and Sasha, you could probably speak better to this than I can, but it's very hard to organize when you work for a company like this. And like there's some ins and outs to it, but like the simple way to put it is they can just drop you from the app like the second you try to organize.
Right.
So I guess that's my rant. Did I have anywhere else to go with it? It's just infuriating to me.
You're absolutely right. And what I think is even worse about it is, you know, we should be in alignment with the taxi cab drivers because of just how egregious this entire move was. But this is the America I know. But we weren't, because it was just so refreshing to finally not have to confront the racism of the taxi cab drivers, that it was like, oh, I'm going to call a ride and they'll actually be there and pick me up and get me to my destination. Oh, I can do that and I don't have to worry about being accosted or possibly ending up not where I belong. You know what I mean? Like, I mean, there was just this level of like safety that I think women of color in particular, felt being able to suddenly have access to this form of transportation when you were out and about that you didn't have before, right? And I can't even like begin to grasp just how infuriating it is to feel like you're sort of fighting at the intersection of these two worlds of like, I want to be the workers' rights person, but also fuck you taxi cab drivers for just generally being shitty for so long, right? Like, it's just like, damn.
100%. I mean, even as like a white guy, like when Lyft first started, I was like, oh, I don't have to deal with taxis anymore. This fucking rules. Like taxis. Yeah, I'm not gonna like go off on it, but like, yeah, the taxi system also needs some fucking work.
Or if you get a taxi in Manhattan and you live in Brooklyn, it's like, oh, I don't have to tell you where I'm going before I get in.
Right.
I think too, like to speak to Flo's point, I think this really goes to show how like racism and sexism can play directly into the boss's interests, right? Like because taxi drivers, like some taxi drivers were perpetuating racism and sexism, and especially racism against women of color, like that undermines solidarity between workers. And that goes to show that's part of why these are connected. That's part of why, like, when you're racist in the workplace, your own rights aren't going to end up being respected because you can't build solidarity and you can't organize with fellow people.
Right.
So,
yeah. So, folks, class struggle is good because they're already fighting it against us. So we
don't be racist or you're fucking up your own class interests.
Yes. Yep. Absolutely.
Yep.
That we even have to say things like, don't be racist.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, it's 2020. We got to do what we got to do.
I guess we're not that surprised, right?
Don't forget that picture. That's just, everything is terrible.
Yeah, I shout out to my friend, Wendy Liu. She wrote a book this year called Abolish Silicon Valley. And I also think it speaks to the point that like, there were some serious problems with like beyond racism and sexism, like taxi industry wasn't very efficient, you know, and still isn't very efficient. And so getting something better is good. And I think people look at socialists a lot and they're like, oh, well, you're anti-progress, right? Like you're anti-new technology, et cetera. And no, that's not what it is. It's like the current iteration of the tech industry and venture capital is just like this hyper-capitalist system that's everything wrong with our society. And like, building technology doesn't have to be that way. Like it can be owned by workers and like actually empower workers rather than undermining labor rights. And so she wrote this book called Abolish Silicon Valley. It really talks about like different models for viewing this, and it's really cool.
I love it. I just read Live, Work, 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 Die. So I think this will be a good second read.
Would you recommend that?
I mean, you're already living out there, so you know.
Well, guys, I'm currently in the middle of penning my own novel called Live, Work, Work, Don't Work. Wait, what the fuck is going on? What's going to happen to me now? I haven't gotten to the end yet, thankfully, but you know, we'll see where it goes from here. It's writing itself as we go. Which is to say that I am a currently unemployed worker due to COVID-19. I have been, though, with this bountiful amount of free time that I suddenly find myself with, been using it to comb through the internet for the most perfect takes on a number of topics, including housing, including workers' rights, racism. It's been a big project of mine to amass only the best of all the takes and distill it down into the most perfect. But I'm spending a lot of time on Twitter sifting through extremely whack takes, and I was going to ask you guys, Dave, do you know of a place that has sort of a centralized feed of only the most perfect takes that could save me some time when I'm looking for my takes?
Skylar, first of all, sorry to hear about your situation.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Oh, here we go.
Flo, I don't know why you would laugh at that.
Yeah. This is my livelihood is ruined, Flo. How dare you?
I'm laughing in capitalism.
The one homeowner on the show. Okay.
I know, right?
I see.
It's even worse. It's even worse. Oh my gosh. Okay.
But there is one home that I own.
Oh my God.
Yes, dude, the double segue. Let's fucking go.
Any new listeners, I just want you to know we are not laughing at their misfortune. We are laughing because Skylar finds a new way to tell us that he's unemployed every single episode. And although it's still not funny that he's unemployed, the new way he finds to segue in has
so
become
good.
hilarious.
It's always great.
And I know that seems like we're terrible, terrible people, but I promise we are not actually laughing at his misfortune. I'm not laughing in capitalism.
Let me tell you about the home I bought about 3 years ago.
Fuck. Shit.
It's called voicesrivercity.com.
Oh my gosh.
And in this little home of mine, in each little room, there is one perfect little take. And you can go comb through it and just kind of check out every little room, or I like to say URL, and find the perfect of takes there. When we first started, we were doing news and arts coverage. We were doing community op-eds from people speaking real truth to power. Obviously we have the SAC Follows the Money project that follows all of the developer money going to our local elected officials. And then most recently, obviously, our most recent iteration of Voices River City is this podcast. And it is usually about an hour or so of perfect takes. Please go check that out. It's a lot of fun. There's some really weird stuff on the site too. As I always say, we're doing more and more news coverage. I broke the story of rent control coming onto the ballot because of the appeals judge's decision recently. So expect more of that. But Voices, you can find us not only in that home of mine. We are also on Twitter at Voices River City, Facebook Voices River City, Instagram at Voices River City. Skylar runs that, and it's always funny as fuck. We have a Patreon, patreon.com/Voices River City. You can go as low as $5 a month, as high as $25 a month, and at that tier you'll get a mug and a t-shirt. But really the $5, it's like a beer at the bar we're not going to right now because of COVID. So every little bit helps. It just means a lot to us to do this work and to have really cool, smart guests on like Sasha. And then
I would also like to point out that it keeps us accountable to you guys.
That's a good point.
We don't need to ask for money from anybody who sucks. We get all of our money from people who are cool like you. And then we are accountable just to you, the community, and not to some fucking shitty capitalist.
Yeah, and if we have any imperfect takes, you can take your money away. So this is my promise to you.
Why would you introduce that as an option?
Yeah, don't give them that option.
Did I do a bad?
Yeah, you did bad.
I am not a business guy. I don't know. Okay.
Hopefully it's not
Give
my
us money
imperfect
if you
take.
want, but if you don't want, you don't have
Right.
to.
I'm all heart.
That's always an option. You just don't tell them that's the option. You don't advertise that one.
Don't show them where the unsubscribe button is on Patreon.
Jesus.
If you'd like to unsubscribe, please click.
Email
You know
me
what?
and
We're
I'll
just
do
going
it
to
myself.
email you the option to
Yeah.
unsubscribe because.
Honestly, we should get that on the next round of t-shirts. It should say Voices River City and then just be like unsubscribe.
I told you, actually, that I like that a lot.
That's kind of tight, honestly.
Yeah.
I told you all when we embarked on this journey that I am not a businessman. So,
I mean, not a businessman telling people how to take things away from us.
Sweet summer child shows himself again.
yeah.
I'm not a
Take
fighter,
everything I
but
have.
I don't hand my money to bullies without request either.
Yeah, I'm very ascetic with my capital. I don't need it. So, okay. We're also on YouTube, Voices River City. You can look at all of our nice little faces as we talk about things that infuriate us. I guess that's everything. We're on Twitter, each of us as our own entity. I am you, no Kempa, YOUKNOWKEMPA.
You can find me at Guillotine for You. That's Guillotine, the number 4, YOU.
I am Shan N.D. Stevens.
And I am at Flojaune, FLOJAUNE.
And Sasha, how can we follow you?
I'm Sasha Perigo, PERIGO.
And that's on Twitter.
On Twitter, yes.
Awesome.
So is there
on
anything else
Twitter.
that you would like to plug or anything else before we sign off?
Yes, I will send y'all the link if you're willing to include it in your the description of the episode. But there's a letter signing tool where you can go to Tenants Together and you can send a letter in support of that like eviction defense bill we were talking about in literally 1 minute to your representatives. You don't even have to talk on the phone. So yeah, and that's AB 1436. You don't want to use the letter, you can call your representative who you can find online.
And you heard the perfectest of takes for 20 minutes on that bill. So you know what's coming. So just sign it.
Yeah,
don't
and like
put
honestly, the
clicking
whole like
cheese.
you don't have to talk to anybody on the phone thing is a big sell for me.
Super dope.
Yeah, not into
I think
talking on the phone.
also, like, I think a lot of leftists, rightfully so, make fun of the petition thing. Like, oh, sign a petition. Like, what the hell is that going to do?
Change.org, yeah.
Yeah, I will say this isn't a petition. Like, representatives actually, when they get a bunch of letters in support of something, they're like, they don't actually listen to any of their constituents. And so if they get like 20 letters in support of something, they're like, oh my God, all of my constituents must support this. So this is a petition that actually helps.
Yeah. So do it, folks. Yeah, and do send the link. So I'll put it in the show notes.
Cool.
Sasha, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us,
Yes,
chill
you.
with us, and yell with us.
Yeah, it was
It's
a real
been a joy.
pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. It's great to meet you all.
All right, guys. Well, I think that's going to do it for this episode. And we will see you in a few days. In the meantime, it's important to us that you know that we love you and that we want you to stay safe.
Stay sane.
Stay healthy.
And stay the fuck away from me. Have a good
All
night.
right.